discombobulated. I'm always discombobulated, but maybe more so than usual. You're comfortable with the upside down A, the backwards E, the variables X, Y, Z, and so forth. And as basically a blueprint for standard translations, the 4 standard forms of the quantified sentence, where we're talking about relationships between classes of thing or groups of thing, right? So our standard translation of our universal affirmative is the upside down A with the variable immediately to its right, open paren, subject class variable. Yes, in our version of the system, the variables within the sentence are in the parenthetical, just or in a pair of parentheses, just like the individual constant, right? But here I've taken away those parens just because it's a little bit cleaner visually, right? So subject class, arrow, predicate class, the universal negative, same beginning, in other words, the upside down A, variable, subject class, arrow, negation, predicate, class, close paren, and then our 2 existential claims, affirmative and negative. Notice that your negative, or your negation rather, is in front of the predicate class for both your universal negative and your existential negative. And then if memory serves, we chatted a bit about the equivalences. And I mentioned to you that, and I showed you one version of equivalences where we're looking at an atomic sentence and then a literal, right? So an atomic sentence would be universal P or existential P, and then a literal would be a negation in front of or behind or both, right? So the reason why I mentioned the equivalences early on is because it makes sense for us to know that there are some sentences that we interpret in a way that is maybe notated differently than the standard notation, but is still equivalent to it. Similarly to when we talk about the De Morgan's equivalences, right? Ella, quiet. The De Morgan's equivalences where we know that the not both is equivalent to either not one or not the other. And when we see the not both, we might interpret that, we might make the conversion because it feels more comfortable to us intellectually, right? But we know we go back and forth. So that's part of my thinking. So if memory serves, this is where we left off. And then, so just a couple of other items for us to think about, and then let's talk about any questions, problems, confusions that you might have. When you're looking at an ordinary English sentence, you want to think about how much of a given class we're talking about. Are we talking about exhausting the class where we're talking about the universal, or are we talking about less than the entirety of the class, which would be an existential? So remember, the universal is translated with, the universal in ordinary English is all or every. We can also think in terms of times, like, all times or whenever, right? And then the existential is going to be at least one. We typically translate or think of the existential in terms of many or most, right? So those will be our go-to translations. And then the question about the scope of the quantifier involves the relationship of that initial class to another class, right? So when we say, every dog barks, we're saying that the scope of the quantifier covers the dogs and the barking things. More specifically, it's the entirety of the dog class related to barking things. And so when we've got multiple classes of thing, and the scope of the quantifier covers every single one of those classes, we've got our parentheses, right? Okay, so let's take a look at some more examples, and you'll notice these are a little bit more complicated than what we saw on Tuesday, but I hope that the using the standard translations that we saw under the 4 Aristotelian forms, that those you will use as templates, right? So let's take the first example first, and then I want to say a little bit about domains of discourse. I will liken the discussion to my own experience. And some of you will say, yeah, that makes sense. I have a similar experience. And some of you will say, well, I don't know why Mia's making this. It just seems like she's having a really hard time with this. This is much easier than she thinks it is. That's great too, but just know that uh, you'll want to be able to articulate why and how it is that you get it, right? Because that'll make your understanding more robust. Okay, so all students in the room are prepared. So I write in a parenthetical, domain of discourse is limited to people. If you were to say that you want to further clarify, not assume we know the domain of discourse is limited to people, I want to further clarify that we are talking about things that are people and students, right? You would introduce that additional class. But the idea here is we assume that we know, before we translate, that students are people, right? That we're not talking about non-human students. So we get the following: for every X, if X is a student and X is in the room, then X is prepared. Right? So notice that we have our standard universal affirmative, right? Insofar as we've got our arrow, right, with the antecedent and the consequent. And it just so happens to be the case that the antecedent is itself compounded. That said, we could make an equivalence where we'd have 2 arrows. We can go back to chapters 3 and 4 to think about that. Then we have no unprepared students are happy. So for every X, if X is a student and X is not prepared, then X is not happy. And notice the following. In sentence 1, we have the affirm prepared, and then in sentence 2, we have the negated prepared, right? So it's not the case that the student is prepared. If I treat sentence 1 and sentence 2 as, let's say, part of some argument, then I need to make sure that prepared and unprepared are distinguished from each other, hence the negation. On the other hand, if you were to say, I'm going to treat sentence 2, no unprepared students are happy, as an isolated sentence, and I'm going to have you, for example, the capital letter U, stand for unprepared, you could certainly do that, right? So how you translate is going to depend on what the context is and certain assumptions that you make, certain stipulations that you make. Then we have a set of existential claims. Many deserving or in-need students have scholarships. And I, typically just translate in the order that the thing is given to you. So I have, there is some X. The X is an S and either D or N and H. You could, because you know that the conjunction, a series of conjunction statements can be, swapped around. I think we were talking about that the other day when Kate was talking about the sentence, everything is a large cube. We could also say everything is a cube that is large, right? You can swap them without losing the logical meaning. Now let's take a look at the last example and see what you think about the equivalence, right? So we have an existential claim. We also have a universal claim, but they're saying the same thing. So Fariba does not sit to the left of any unprepared students. It's not the case that there is something, the thing is a student and not prepared, and Fariba sits to the left of it. Notice what happens when we move the negation. We push the negation through. For every x, if x is a student and not prepared, then it's not the case that Fariba sits to the left of it. How are we doing? What do we think? So far, so good? I know, it's just stunned silence. You're all so happy. Okay, let's do this. Hold on. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? Let me turn on this other monitor because I want us to have more crap.
Really quickly, can I ask for the third example? It says many students have scholarships. So would you just, like, is that just saying every instead of many?
So yeah, Elizabeth, yeah. Hold on just one second. I apologize. Yes, please ask questions. I want you to ask questions. I'm just not clever enough to work my monitors. Okay, so okay, forgive me. Ask the question again. Which one are you on? Many deserving students?
Yeah, I was just saying, like, many. Are we just saying every instead of, like, how do you clarify many?
Okay, so although there's some reason to think that certain ordinary English expressions are not, fully are not fully captured, are not fully captured by the existential, it still is the case that we translate into an existential claim a sentence, any sentence that is not exhaustive in terms of the way that it talks about its group. So long as the sentence says at least one, but it doesn't assert every single one. In other words, the class that's covered by the quantifier is not exhausted, I should say, then that's going to be an existential. So many is a whole bunch, but it's not the entirety of the deserving or in need students.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You good? Yeah? Okay. Excellent. Okay, so before we move into chapter 11, let me let you know two things. One is, when we're done with chapter 11, the only thing we have left to do is look at our intro and elim rules for quantifiers, and those map onto our framework of intro and elims back in chapter 6 and 8, and then we're done with new material. And that leaves us the rest of the semester to just drill, practice, ask questions, dig deeper, right? So that's one thing I want to mention. So give yourselves a pat on the back because you're doing you're not only doing really good work, but you're super close to. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, applaud yourselves. But you're also really close to the end, and you already know how important practice is. Related to that, I want to point out that usually at this time of the year, when we're in our normal, meeting in class twice a week routine, folks will come to office hours, not just with specific questions that they want that they want answered, but they'll also just come and hang out in my office and work. And then as they're working and questions arise, they say, "Hey, Mia, I have a question," then we talk. So it's kind of like just like a workshop period. So if you want to do that, but in the online office hours, feel free. So, when I'm in office hours, you might say, "Yeah, hey, I'm here, I'm working, but I don't want to talk to you right now. I'll talk to you when I have a question," right? Just feel free to do that. And then also know that if there are other times that you want to chat, if you, for example, if you can't make office hours or you don't want to come to office hours, but you want to meet at other times, we can make that happen. Okay, because this is the time when that of year when that typically ramps up. Second thing I want to mention is that so from chapter 9, I want you to be comfortable with understanding how to read an ordinary English sentence in terms of the requisite or relevant, if you can think about translating in two ways, but the requisite or relevant quantifier, right? So what is the sentence expressing? Is it expressing a universal or an existential? Is it affirmative? Is it negative? You want to, in connection with that process, remember your 4 standard forms, right? So moving into chapter 11, we're going to add to that base, right? So we're going to talk about what we're looking at when we're looking at sentences involving multiple quantifiers of the same type. So let's say 2 universals or 2 existentials. And then what we're looking at when we're looking at multiple quantifiers of 2 different types. That is, 1 or more universals plus 1 or more existential. So what we want to do, and this can get really confusing and complicated, but don't stress over that, is to express the logical structure of multiply quantified sentences without losing what the sentence actually means, in ordinary English. And that's why things can get a little bit rough, is sometimes we think that the logical notation says more than it does, or sometimes we think the logical notation says one thing, but then it turns out that it actually says something different than from what we wanted to express. So, for example, how do we articulate in logical notation the ordinary English sentence, "Some cubes are to the left of some dodecks," right? We will see 2 ways to notate multiply quantified sentences. There's the prenex form where we put the quantifiers out front, both in this case quantifiers out front of the parenthetical that the quantifiers range over. And then there's the nested or embedded quantifier notation. Some of you are going to like one more than the other. Doesn't really matter. I happen to have my preference. But as long as we get it right, it doesn't matter unless the textbook exercise is telling us to do something a specific way. It really doesn't matter whether we use prenex or nested or embedded quantifiers, or we use that form. Okay, so you already know about keeping the Aristotelian forms in mind. All right, so let's look at some examples and see if they resonate with you or if you have questions about them. Remember, some cubes are to the left of some dodecks. Here is the first form, and as a reminder, I hope that it's clear. This is just a part of the bullet point. It's not any sort of logical notation, okay? Okay, so existential x, existential y, cube x, dodec y, left of xy. Now, the first thing you might notice is that we've used or we've added to our repertoire the variable y. But remember that a variable is a placeholder. It doesn't specify anything at all. And so technically we could use two x's. We've got the y because visually it's a nice cue for us to know that we're talking about the variable related to the dodec. But even there, the reality is that we know from Tarski's world that cubes and dodecs aren't the same thing. So it's not like if we used x for both that we would mistake one for the other. Okay, the two quantifiers out front of the parenthetical is what we call, or the form of the two quantifiers out front of the parenthetical is what's called prenex form. But notice, now take a look at the second version of the same example, and notice that the second existential, the existential covering the dodec variable, is nested or embedded. So the second example reads as follows: there is something, it's a cube, and there is something, it's a dodec, and the cubes are to the left of the dodecs, or the at least one cube is to the left of at least one dodec. Or you could say at least one cube is to the left of at least one dodec. Now take a look at the second example where we've got the quantified sentences, or sorry, the universally quantified sentences. All tets are to the right of every cube. So first example, or first notation, first translation, for every x and every y, if x is a tet and y is a cube, then x is to the right of y. Or every tet is to the right of every cube. Second version here now, so that's prenex form, here's nested. For every x, if x is a tet, then for every y, if y is a cube, x is to the right of it. If you guys were to simply instantiate the two universally quantified sentences, does it make sense to say that you would have this? So let's suppose that we're going to make A is a tet, and I'm not writing everything out because you guys already know that my annotation work is not the best. But let's suppose that we instantiate the universal so that we're saying if A is a tet and B is a cube, then A is to the right of B. Now look at the second example, and you have instead, and now I'm just going to eliminate the constant just because it'll go faster. And forgive me because I put an open paren here. I wasn't thinking. We don't need that. No, screw it. I did the very thing I said I wasn't going to do. Sorry, guys. You're used to me doing goofy things. Okay. Can you eyeball that from the standpoint of truth functionality, the conjunction in the parenthetical right, becomes an arrow, and then the arrow becomes and then the arrow is bound by the parenthetical. So truth functionally, these say the same thing. Now, one question you might ask is, well, why do we move when we nest or embed that second quantifier? Why do we change the conjunction to an arrow? What do you think about that? I mean, if we didn't change the conjunction to an arrow, do you think that that would change the meaning of the sentence? So think about that. We can always come back and chat more about it. But does it make sense to say that your pre-next form, which I'm circling with my cursor, your pre-next form, right, looks like the standard translation for each of your quantifier types. The nested form, given what the sentence is saying of the existential, looks the same. It's just that you've embedded the second existential. And the nested universal looks the same. It's just that now the main arrow is the one on the is the first arrow, right? The second arrow is bound by the second universal quantifier. Okay. So one thing that's going to come up for us when we're dealing with quantifiers that range over two different, let's say, sets of objects, right? But let's again say that we're talking about Tursky's world. The objects are of the same type. Then we have to find a way to distinguish these from those, whether we're talking about all of these and all of those, or some of these and some of those. So here again, one of the things that I find really interesting about doing this sort of work, and this goes back to the domain of discourse that I had mentioned earlier when I talked about in the example students in the room. Remember from chapter 9? And I said, well, you can assume the domain of discourse is restricted to persons, or you can specify that with your notation. Well, that basic idea of the domain of discourse is coming back again here, right? How do we specify that the dodecs are two different sets of the same object? Well, we do that by asserting that the x's and the y's aren't the same. Or if we were using the same variable, it would look weird, it would feel awkward. We would, how is an x not equal to an x? But we could, in principle, we could do that. All right, so take a look at the example. All the dodecs are to the left or to the right of each other. Notice that the each other doesn't get articulated in logic, right? That here's how the claim reads. For every x and for every y, if x and y are dodecs, then x is to the left of or to the right of y. But if you were to instantiate, that is to peel off the quantifier and instantiate the variables, you could say that, A is a dodec and is to the left of or to the right of A. That would be peculiar. would be false, right? Because a thing can't be to the left of or to the right of itself. And so if it comes out false, you would say, well, but that doesn't seem right. I should be able to express the sentence and it should come out true. So the non-equivalence is a way to help us with this. There's a terrific exercise in the textbook that helps us with this, and we're going to look at that together. Okay. But actually, let's go ahead and do that now. It might be useful. So hold tight. Let's just finish up with a little bit more on the multiple quantifiers material. And then what we'll do, so my advice to you is, just start practicing with the exercises from the text. The you try it's are super helpful. Work those. And then what we'll do on Tuesday is we'll come back and do some review, see what sorts of questions, problems, confusions you might have, do some more practice, but then move into chapter 13 so that by Thursday of next week, we're done with new material. Now, there's loads of interesting stuff to do here in chapter 11. And I hope that we'll practice and discuss at a level that's beyond the level at which we're expected to work for our course. But just know that, we'll always work at a level that's going to, I hope, retroactively make stuff make more sense. That'll help illuminate and elucidate prior material. Okay, so we talked about that exercise from chapter 11 that helps us understand how we can distinguish sets of things that are the same, right? In a way that is not. Sorry, let me rephrase that. We saw in that exercise how to distinguish sets of things that are the same, where just a standard translation just doesn't capture the distinction. Okay. So I don't know if this note on this remember note on page 291 is helpful. I remember not finding it helpful initially, but then over time I went, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I've got it, right? So just because you've got different variables, X's and Y's, doesn't mean thereby that you're talking about different things, because the X's and the Y's don't specify things. It's not like X's and Y's are the same as saying A and B, where we know A and B are not the same name, or they're different names. Okay, so we are going to be explicit about identifying that domain of discourse. It's a little bit easier to do that when we're dealing with mixed quantifiers in some sense. It's also sometimes easier to understand the way to read a sentence back out after it's already translated, if we haven't seen the original English sentence, when we're dealing with mixed quantifiers. But the order of our quantifiers when we're dealing with the same type, so two universals or two existentials, is not important, but mixed quantifiers, that is universal then existential or existential then universal, that order does make a huge difference to what we're saying. Just a quick note, I don't know what this typo is. I'll have to look at that, but please note that that's not relevant to us. So I think you can see the order of the quantifier makes a big difference, right? Everyone likes someone versus someone likes everyone. And then the last thing I want to say is notice that the first translation, universal X, existential Y, likes XY, that assumes the domain of discourse is restricted to persons. But notice that because I get nervous, I don't know, I want to be explicit that we're talking about this, type of thing, I go ahead and I specify persons. So for every X, if X is a person, then there is at least one Y that's a person such that X likes Y. Some of you might say, Mia, I hate that, don't do it. But I did it. Someone likes everyone. There is an X for every Y such that X likes Y. Or there is something X that likes everything Y. That's the second example. Okay, so this is the set of basic ideas that we want to think about to use as our foundation, and then we'll build on this, like I said, on Tuesday. But in the meantime, let's see what, if any, questions, problems, confusions you might have.